The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Julian Carter pulled his car into the parking lot outside the municipal courthouse in Hawthorne, North Carolina. The warm morning sun cast sharp shadows across the pavement as Julian let out a long, frustrated breath. Being late grated against every fiber of his disciplined nature. As a federal prosecutor, Julian's world revolved around precision and preparation, but today had thrown him off balance. This morning was supposed to be straightforward. Nothing more than disputing an error in a property tax reassessment on the home his grandmother had left him. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes, and Julian had spent weeks compiling documents to prove the adjustment was baseless. That house was more than a piece of property. It was the bedrock of his childhood, where he learned life's hardest lessons under his grandmother's caring yet firm guidance. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt, Julian exuded the calm professionalism that had earned him respect in the legal community. However, his morning had been anything but smooth. An urgent call about a human trafficking case had derailed his schedule. The defense had filed a last-minute motion, and Julian had no choice but to respond immediately. He had pored over the motion, offered detailed feedback to his team, and then rushed to make it to court, knowing full well he was cutting it close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance revealed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Judge Walter Klein has a reputation for being tough on tardiness. Be careful. Julian sighed, slipping the phone into his briefcase. While he respected the need for punctuality, he wasn't overly concerned. He came armed with facts, solid, indisputable evidence. But the warning lingered in his mind, a faint unease that he couldn't shake. The courthouse doors swung open to reveal a familiar scene. Unlike the grand federal buildings where Julian usually worked, Hawthorne's municipal court felt more modest. The walls were a faded beige, the benches scuffed and worn from years of use. The faint scent of coffee mingled with the sharper smell of aging paper. Despite its tired appearance, the building buzzed with activity. People shuffled through the halls clutching paperwork, their faces clouded with worry over minor legal disputes, parking tickets, neighborhood squabbles, and small claims. Checking his watch, Julian noted it was 8:50 a.m. He had just 10 minutes to find his courtroom. Following the signs down a narrow corridor, he passed people murmuring in hushed tones. He reached room 204, where a brass plaque identified the presiding judge as Walter Klein. Julian adjusted his tie, took a steadying breath, and stepped inside. The room was already crowded, a low hum of tension hanging in the air. Julian found an open seat near the back, his practiced calm keeping any irritation at bay. He opened his folder and began reviewing his carefully prepared evidence, scanning through photographs, tax records, and written appeals. A sudden shift in the room's atmosphere pulled his attention to the front. Judge Klein entered the courtroom, tall and imposing, with sharp gray hair and penetrating green eyes. The man exuded authority. Without uttering a word, he commanded respect, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom like a searchlight. "All rise," the bailiff announced, prompting a shuffle of movement as the room stood. Julian rose with the others, his posture straight and steady as the judge settled into his chair. The noise faded into a stark silence. The judge began calling cases with mechanical precision, his tone clipped and impersonal. Julian watched as one by one, individuals approached the bench, their cases dispensed with in quick succession. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit slipped into the courtroom a few minutes late, settling into a seat without drawing attention. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes entered and quietly took a spot near the front. Neither of them warranted so much as a glance from the judge. Noted, Julian thought to himself, but he turned his focus back to his case. At 9:15 a.m., Julian's name was called. He rose, gathering his folder and walking to the podium with measured composure. As he approached, Judge Klein's gaze fixed on him, his expression hardening. "You're late, Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice slicing through the room's quiet. "Do you believe this court's time is less valuable than your own?" Julian raised his hands slightly in acknowledgement, his tone measured and respectful. "Your Honor, I apologize for my delay. I was handling urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't absolve tardiness. This court runs on discipline and respect. If you can't adhere to that, perhaps you should reevaluate your priorities. Julian felt the weight of the room's attention. Eyes were trained on him, their gazes ranging from curiosity to discomfort. But he didn't falter. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I understand the importance of punctuality. If I may, I'd like to present." Judge Walter Klein waved a hand, his tone dismissive. "We'll address your property tax adjustment shortly. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of this court." His words landed with the weight of finality. "You are hereby fined $750. The declaration felt like a hammer striking an anvil. Julian Carter's jaw tightened for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "Your Honor," Julian began, his voice steady and respectful, "may I offer an explanation?" The judge's gavel came down sharply. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Julian stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about being late, it was something more profound, a disparity that felt familiar yet still infuriating. Returning to his seat, Julian opened his folder, but this time his focus shifted. The meticulously organized property tax documents became secondary. He began jotting notes, his pen gliding across the page with deliberate speed. Meanwhile, Judge Klein carried on with the next case, his tone as unyielding as ever. Julian's thoughts swirled. The fine wasn't just steep, it was punitive. For tardiness in a municipal court, such a penalty was excessive. And then there was the glaring disparity. Others had arrived late too. He glanced discreetly at the young woman near the front, scrolling on her phone, who had slipped in earlier, without so much as a warning. Then there was the man in the gray blazer, now presenting his case, who had walked in well after the judge had begun the session. Both had gone unnoticed, while Julian had been singled out. The pattern was undeniable. Julian's legal instincts kicked in, dissecting the situation with precision. Around him he noted the shifting expressions of the other attendees, subtle disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity etched on their faces. He wasn't the only one who had observed the inconsistency, but no one else dared to speak. "Next case," Judge Klein's voice rang out. Julian's name echoed through the room once again. Rising from his seat, he strode back to the podium, his posture measured and composed. He was determined not to falter under the judge's sharp gaze, which bore down on him like a challenge. "Your Honor," Julian began, "I have brought documentation to address the erroneous property tax adjustment on my family home." He placed the folder on the podium, opening it with deliberate precision. "This," he gestured to a specific page, "shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The recent adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase issued without proper notification or explanation." Judge Klein leaned back in his chair, his demeanor radiating disinterest. "I will review it in due course, Mr. Carter. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that your federal responsibilities justify disrespecting this court?" Julian's composure held firm. "Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, an urgent matter requiring immediate attention. I believed that prioritizing—" The judge's eyes narrowed, his expression unyielding. "Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking this court's rules. Procedures exist for a reason." It wasn't the words themselves that struck Julian, but the tone. The cold dismissal, the underlying message that nothing he said would suffice. His professional accomplishments, his respectful demeanor, even the gravity of his explanation, all were brushed aside as inconsequential in this courtroom. Julian took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. The judge's face darkened, the tension in the room escalating. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Carter?" Judge Klein asked, his voice tight. "I am asking for clarity." Julian replied evenly. "Ensuring fairness is critical, not just for myself but for everyone here." The judge's gavel slammed down with force, cutting through the charged atmosphere. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court." Judge Walter Klein's gavel came down sharply. "Your fine stands," he declared, his tone leaving no room for debate. Julian Carter inclined his head slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. He returned to his seat, aware of the eyes following him. Some gazes were filled with quiet admiration, others with unease, but all carried a shared sense of tension. This wasn't the first time Julian had encountered bias wrapped in the cloak of authority, but this moment was different. The energy in the room felt electric, charged with an unspoken question. What will he do next? Discreetly, Julian pulled out his phone and began typing notes, his movements purposeful and controlled. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot. As the courtroom session continued its routine, the atmosphere had already shifted. Julian's presence was a quiet but undeniable force, rippling through the room. Others noticed it too. An older black man, seated 2 rows ahead, turned slightly, offering Julian a brief but knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers moving across the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort palpable. A young woman, likely a law student, sat in the back corner, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Her wide-eyed expression reflected a mix of awe and determination. When the session concluded, Julian lingered, his briefcase resting by his side. He watched the other attendees leave, their steps weighted with the residue of what had just transpired. Some whispered in hushed tones, others walked in silence, but all carried the heavy understanding that they had witnessed something out of the ordinary. The young law student stayed behind, her notebook still open as she glanced toward Julian with a flicker of hope in her eyes. She wasn't the only one wondering what he might do next. As Julian stepped outside, the crisp morning air failed to dispel the tension that clung to him. The courthouse bustled with the hum of routine activity, attorneys on cell phones, clerks carrying files, but inside Julian's mind a plan was already taking shape. He paused on the courthouse steps, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. He muttered to himself, "Not yet," and slipped the phone into his pocket. Instead, he stepped aside and reviewed his notes. The disparity he had experienced in Judge Klein's courtroom wasn't incidental, it was structural. His instincts as a federal prosecutor told him he had just uncovered the seeds of a much larger issue, one that extended far beyond his property tax dispute. Sitting in his car, Julian opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The embossed emblem of the Department of Justice caught the sunlight, glinting with quiet authority. He knew this was the first step, the beginning of something far bigger than a single courtroom fine. By the time Julian re-entered the courthouse, most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter now, with only a few stragglers flipping through documents or awaiting their turn. Judge Klein sat at the bench, leafing through papers. His demeanor was calm, though the wariness of the morning session showed in his posture. Julian walked purposefully to the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk glanced up, her fingers pausing mid-typing. Judge Klein looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Mr. Carter, this session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment." "With respect, Your Honor," Julian began, his voice measured but firm, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He raised his badge slightly, ensuring it was visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Julian Carter, Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina. I've served with the Department of Justice for over a decade, specializing in cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands hovering over the documents on his desk. The color drained from his face as Julian's words echoed in the quiet room. A few remaining spectators stopped what they were doing, their attention fully captured by the exchange. "I was late this morning," Julian continued, his tone unwavering, "because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention. And while I respect the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the stark disparity in how cases were handled here today." Judge Klein's lips pressed into a thin line, his discomfort evident. "Mr. Carter, if you believe there was a procedural issue, you are welcome to file a formal complaint." "I've already begun documenting the events of this morning," Julian replied, holding up his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I have a duty to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. The judge shifted in his seat, his composure faltering. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Carter? I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor, Julian said calmly. As a federal prosecutor, my career is built on ensuring justice is applied equally, no matter who stands before the bench. What I witnessed here today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Julian and the judge, her fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard. The young law student in the back corner resumed her furious note-taking, her expression now one of fascination. Judge Klein cleared his throat, attempting to regain his authority. This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the proper channels. Julian placed his badge and identification on the podium. I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that fairness and equity are upheld in every courtroom. The judge gripped the arms of his chair, visibly uneasy. For the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. You may go, Mr. Carter, he said, his voice quieter now. Julian collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I will ensure this is addressed properly. As he exited the courtroom, Julian felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that had long ignored its own flaws. Outside, the cool air did little to ease the tension still gripping Julian. Standing on the courthouse steps, he pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He meticulously documented every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed during the session. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning. The response came quicker than Julian anticipated. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from his supervisor, Angela Rivera, a seasoned attorney known for her sharp instincts and unflinching resolve. Julian, I read your report, Angela began, her tone a mix of urgency and intrigue. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a one-off incident. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Julian replied. What I witnessed yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a larger pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Angela exhaled audibly. I'll contact the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately, but we have to be thorough. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as possible. If this goes public, we need to be prepared. The call ended, but Julian's work was just beginning. He spent hours combing through public records, analyzing fines and penalties issued by Judge Klein over the years. The discrepancies were striking. Minor infractions for black defendants resulted in disproportionately higher fines, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. Julian reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Klein's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories poured in. Some whispered in hushed confidence, others shared boldly. One young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, despite presenting evidence that her car was improperly ticketed. In contrast, a white man with multiple unpaid tickets was fined a fraction of the amount. Another attorney described how Judge Klein often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. It's been happening for years, the attorney said. We've all noticed it, but nobody's been willing to challenge him, until now. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Darby, emerged as a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small, worn notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are my notes," she said hesitantly. "Every time something didn't feel right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore." The notebook was a goldmine of information, meticulously recorded dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment that painted a damning picture of systemic bias. Even the courthouse bailiff, Mark Whitaker, stepped forward. "I've worked here for 15 years, he told investigators. "I've seen it happen over and over. The way he treats people, it's not right." I didn't think I could do anything about it, but now. His statement, like a match to dry kindling, ignited a firestorm. The events of the courtroom began to seep into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed Julian Carter's interaction with Judge Klein shared a detailed account on social media. Within hours, the post went viral, sparking widespread outrage. Comments flooded in, many echoing similar experiences. Other defendants recounted unfair treatment, steep fines, and condescending remarks from the bench. The hashtags Justice for All and Courtroom Bias Now began trending as personal stories of courtroom discrimination flooded online platforms. Headlines soon followed. Bias in Hawthorne Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct. Justice or Prejudice, a judge's record under scrutiny. News outlets from across the state, and eventually the country, picked up the story. Julian, now the reluctant center of attention, chose to stay focused on his investigation rather than engaging with the media frenzy. Calls from reporters were constant, but Julian politely declined interviews, redirecting his energy toward compiling evidence. His disciplined silence only added to the intrigue, while pressure on Judge Klein intensified. As the week unfolded, rumors swirled about Judge Klein being summoned to private meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, insiders whispered that he was beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. By the end of the first week, Julian received a call from his supervisor, Angela Rivera. "The findings so far are staggering," Angela said, her tone grave. "The numbers don't lie, Julian. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the same infractions. This isn't isolated, it's systemic." "What's the next step?" Julian asked. "We're taking this to the State Judicial Board," Angela replied. "And Julian, brace yourself. The media isn't going to let this go." Julian nodded, even as exhaustion pressed against him. This was bigger than anything he had anticipated, but he was determined not to back down. By the end of the second week, the story had gained national traction. News programs ran features with headlines like, "Systemic Bias Unveiled, Prosecutor Takes a Stand. When the Scales of Justice Tip, a Federal Prosecutor's Fight for Fairness." Social media was ablaze. Hashtags like Equal Justice Now and Bias in the Courts dominated the conversation, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in legal systems across the country. Julian stayed focused on consolidating evidence with the Judicial Review Commission. The findings were devastating. Over the past 5 years, records showed that Black defendants faced fines averaging 300% higher than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals by white defendants were routinely ignored, while Black defendants were reprimanded or fined. Requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The data was damning, but it wasn't just statistics. It was the deeply human stories behind the numbers that resonated most. Former defendants began coming forward, some publicly, others anonymously. A Black mother recounted how she was fined $500 for disputing a minor zoning violation, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. "The judge wouldn't even let me finish my explanation," she said. A young man described how Judge Klein had humiliated him in front of the courtroom, questioning his work ethic, before dismissing a similar case involving a white defendant mere minutes later. Community activist groups joined the cause, organizing rallies outside the Hawthorne courthouse. Protesters carried signs reading "Justice should be blind" and "End bias now." Though Julian avoided the public spectacle, he couldn't ignore the significance of what was unfolding. Inside the courthouse, staff members who had worked under Judge Klein for years began sharing their own observations. Mrs. Darby, the court clerk whose notebook of discrepancies had already become critical evidence, continued to cooperate with investigators. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during an interview. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even Mark Whitaker, the bailiff, chose to go public. In a statement to the commission, he said, "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong. It's long past time for something to be done." As the evidence mounted, Judge Klein became increasingly isolated. Where once his authority had been unquestioned, his power now appeared fragile. In a rare public statement, the judge expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. But his words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof to the contrary. Behind closed doors, Judge Klein struggled to contain the fallout. For a man who had built a career on commanding respect, this unraveling was both public and personal. Despite the overwhelming attention directed at him, Julian Carter remained grounded. He continued his duties as a federal prosecutor, fully aware that his responsibilities extended beyond this case. Yet the growing flood of emails, phone calls, and letters pouring into his office was impossible to ignore. Messages arrived from across the nation. Many expressed support, while others shared deeply personal stories of bias they had experienced in courtrooms. One letter in particular stood out. It came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." This growing momentum was no longer confined to Hawthorne, North Carolina. Inspired by Julian's case, activists and reporters began scrutinizing court records statewide. The Judicial Oversight Committee of North Carolina announced a comprehensive review of municipal courts, vowing to eradicate systemic bias wherever it was found. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission released its preliminary report. The findings were staggering. Judge Walter Klein's courtroom practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader, deeply entrenched issue. Black defendants faced disproportionately higher fines and harsher treatment compared to white defendants for similar offenses. Structural inequities allowed such patterns to persist unchecked for decades. The report called for sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training for all judges, regular audits of court decisions to identify disparities, the creation of independent oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants to monitor courtroom proceedings. The pressure on Judge Klein became unbearable. Faced with the likelihood of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, he announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe it is in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." The reaction to his resignation was mixed. Some viewed it as an implicit admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward healing. For Julian, it was a moment of vindication, but not one for celebration. "This is just the beginning," he told his colleagues. "The real work starts now." As reforms began to take shape, Julian found himself in an unexpected role: educator and advocate. Invitations to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences poured in. At one such event, a young black law student approached him after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Julian smiled, humbled by her words. "The fight is just beginning," he replied, "but if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after the morning that set everything in motion, the courthouse in Hawthorne looked noticeably different. The tired beige walls had been repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors. Signs in multiple languages now directed people to resources such as payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. Near the entrance, a small but significant plaque had been installed. "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courthouse, the changes were even more pronounced. Judge Klein was no longer presiding, having quietly left the bench. In his place, a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms were already in motion. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who addressed the subtle ways discrimination could influence decision-making. Julian stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, scanning the room as he prepared to address a group of local judges and lawyers about the implemented changes. He felt a mix of pride and cautious optimism. Progress had been made, but the road ahead was still long. Julian's efforts sparked a wave of change that extended far beyond Hawthorne. Communities across North Carolina and eventually the entire country began reevaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards adopted new protocols, including mandatory case outcome audits focusing on racial and socioeconomic disparities, oversight committees to ensure fairness and accountability in courtroom proceedings. The momentum in Julian's office was palpable. His team, inspired by his actions, dove into their work with renewed purpose. The framed find from that fateful morning now hung on Julian Carter's office wall, not as a trophy, but as a symbol of why he had taken a stand. Below it hung a photograph of a recent event, a group of young law students who had established a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their hopeful smiles radiated optimism, and Julian couldn't help but feel a profound responsibility to the next generation of legal minds. The ripple effects of his stand had extended far beyond Hawthorne, North Carolina. Mark Whitaker, the veteran bailiff who had once served under Judge Walter Klein, now led training sessions on recognizing and preventing bias in the courtroom. Addressing a group of new recruits, he said, "Our job isn't just to maintain order, it's to make sure everyone who walks through these doors is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, speak up. Silence is complicity." Meanwhile, Mrs. Darby, the court clerk, whose meticulous records had been instrumental in exposing the truth, had been promoted. She now oversaw a newly established program focused on ethical court practices, mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Julian's influence extended well beyond the legal system. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. Many of his students, inspired by his story, stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a young woman approached him, a notebook filled with ideas for judicial reform in hand. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked earnestly. Julian paused, considering her question. Finally, he said, "Listen. To the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up, listening is where real change begins." The reforms were not without resistance. Some judges and attorneys complained that the new oversight measures undermined their authority. However, the evidence was irrefutable. Within a year, racial disparities in fines and sentencing in Hawthorne's municipal court had decreased significantly. Payment plans were approved more frequently, and defendants reported feeling treated with greater respect and fairness. For Julian, the most rewarding moments came from the people whose lives had been touched by his work. One day, an elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that fateful morning returned to thank Julian in person. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd live to see the day when someone finally said, 'Enough. Thank you for giving us hope.'" Another day, Julian received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place," the letter read. Julian read the letter twice before placing it in a folder he had labeled Impact. Leaning back in his chair, he let the weight of the moment settle over him. It was never about him. It never had been. It was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long, voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Julian walked back into the courthouse, where it had all started. This time he wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part to honor his efforts. As he stepped up to the podium, Julian looked out at the audience. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room. Their faces reflected a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws," Julian began, his voice steady. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Julian's focus remained on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. The work was far from over, but as Julian stood there, he knew this was a step in the right direction.